Each of us has a unique career story to tell. For some, these fly high like rocket launches. For others, they're more like the game of chutes and ladders, with advances and setbacks along the way. Either way, we learn countless lessons from these experiences. And that's what we put into the spotlight here at Career Sessions Career Lessons. Join discussions featuring a variety of guests sharing their stories of ups and downs, as well as the secrets of their success and what drives them to continue moving forward. We break down the tools and resources that will help you establish your dream career and realize your professional goals. Here's your host, J.R. Lowry.
I'm J.R. Lowry. This is Career Sessions Career Lessons, which is brought to you by Pathwise.io. Pathwise is dedicated to helping you live the career you deserve, providing career coaching, content, courses, and community. Basic membership is free, so visit Pathwise.io online and join today. Today, my guest is Jon Guerster. Jon is a partner at Activate Capital, a venture capital and private equity firm that invests in platforms for a sustainable, resilient future. He is also the chairman and founder of Therm Solutions, which is accelerating the world's transition from high global warming potential refrigerants that are still used in more than 99% of the world's HVAC systems. Jon has been a consistent presence in the sustainability space for almost 20 years, having founded and run Groom Energy Solutions for 16 years, starting in 2005, through its acquisition by Dalkia in 2016 and up through 2021. Groom, now Dalkia Energy Solutions, is a market-leading provider of commercial and industrial building efficiency solutions. Prior to entering the sustainability space, Jon's earlier career years were spent at JP Morgan, HP, Open Market, and Charles River Ventures. Along the way, he has also co-founded and served on the board of Digital Lumens and served in an advisory capacity for Recurve and Civi Ventures, among others. He is a patent holder and was a 2020 Environment plus Energy Leader Top 100 honoree. Jon earned his bachelor's degree in engineering from Duke University, where he was a few years ahead of me, and his MBA from Northwestern University. He and his wife, Kim, live north of Boston and have 3 children.
Jon, welcome. Good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been a long time. We were catching up before we started recording. It's been a long time since our days on the Pratt School of Engineering Board of Advisors. That was a long time ago. So anyway, good to catch up. What are you doing today? Tell our audience about Activate Capital and your role there.
Yeah, so I started with Activate full-time this year. So last year. So I'm 1 year into it full-time, or I'd done it a bit part-time. And it started like a lot of things in business. It started because I knew somebody I'd worked with in the past. I liked him, respected him, trusted him, thought I'd want to be around him. Obviously, venture capital is an industry that can be pretty exciting. And I had been in it 20 years before. So the platform is a growth investing platform. It's venture capital, but it's not early stage or seed. It's really a stage where the companies are still going to be raising capital to invest, where they'll still be, burning capital into big markets, but where we like to think we can bring some value around probably 3 markets. It's energy, mobility, and industrial tech. So generally it's under climate tech. Mm-hmm. And so I'm a partner at Activate in a new fund that we raised that was coincidental with me joining. It's a $500 million fund.
You started actually with them as an operating partner, right?
Yeah, that was the middle of 2021. We agreed that my background at that point was as an operating executive in the energy tech space.
Right.
And we thought I could start to work with some of the portfolio companies that were already investments that Activate had made. And we knew we'd be raising a new fund, which we announced, maybe the middle of last year. So the operating partner role, it is common as a term. I've had some people ask me, what's an operating partner? It's very custom to the firm. Our firm is 15 people, but the term is normally more associated with private equity, which is ownership structure investment versus where we operate as a minority investor. And operating partners, I'm sure we both have friends who are inside of the large private equity firms, and they're typically specialists to try to help the portfolios that are of companies that are owned, where in venture, it's a little bit different. Your capacity of influence is slightly different, but I am definitely wearing a hat more today. As you and I reflect on how long it's been since we've known each other, I wear a hat probably more now as an operator than I do as an investor until I've been in it a little bit longer.
But you caught the sustainability bug almost what, 20 years ago when you founded Groom, right? You were with Charles River Ventures, so in the VC space prior to that. So how did you get kind of into this, out of VC into entrepreneurship and into the sustainability space back then?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you it was profound. I've definitely over my career in this broad set of sectors that you call sustainability today, I've met people who like literally out of high school were like, we are going to focus on things that fit into the sustainability bucket. I was not that. For me, it was we were, you and I are both Boston folks, and I knew energy tech was strong in Boston. And so I was hopeful to try to find a startup in the energy tech sector, but I didn't have an understanding of the sector. I couldn't spell kilowatt hour. So it was a little bit more that I knew the broad sector was interesting. I liked the domain. And I was just fortunate enough to meet some people who ended up becoming the basis for what we started that became Groom Energy. So, now that many years later, I think I'm better able to assess patterns of adoption. Of course, it's a feel-good category. It relates a lot if we're going to talk about sort of running a company. And if you're going to run a company in climate tech or you're going to run a company in oil and gas, like
Right.
you can guess it'd be a shitload more fun to have a team you're promoting that you say, listen, we're doing something that has a real fulfillment in life. Not that oil and gas doesn't for some people, but there is a broader awareness today than there was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the whole topic of sustainability and, global warming, climate change, however you want to describe it, there's significantly more awareness of it than there was, back in the days when you started Groom. I described it a little bit in the introduction, but give the audience a little bit more of a description of exactly what the business is doing.
Groom Energy was an enterprise-focused ESCO, is sometimes used the term, but energy service company. And the objective was to help commercial industrial companies reduce their energy consumption of their buildings. And we started in 2005. And if you can imagine what I was going through coming out of venture, when I told my venture capital friends I was doing a building energy efficiency retrofit company where we were going to turnkey install projects that retrofit buildings so their energy consumption was lower, they just tuned out and they said, "You're not doing solar?" There was such an awareness around the renewable side. Energy efficiency was definitely not sexy. But that's the business we started building in 2005, and it ended up working out. We can talk about sort of the things that happened along the way. But it was a straight services business that was in a category that has obviously awareness around the sustainability category. It's an easy one to say it has an environmental impact, but it was enterprise selling. It was convincing corporate managers to change their behavior and making capital investment for reducing consumption.
Were you doing LEDs right at the beginning, or did that come later?
No, that came later. So we did typically in a building, the loads in a building like your home are basically lighting, heating, and air conditioning. And then there's control systems on all those. And so that's true in most commercial buildings, and each building type is slightly different. But what happened was we had started the company, we were doing well, we started in Boston, and we just started literally cold calling. I can still remember getting hung up by every plant manager. We were doing kind of industrial buildings. We were doing warehouses, big. We were literally using Google to look for big rooftops to find the biggest buildings because they had the biggest loads. And so we did a lot of lighting with fluorescent lighting retrofits off of the traditional systems. And because I've been in venture and tech side, we started to study LED applications, and the math was broken. It was a traditional, the curve of semiconductors. It was just too expensive. Yeah. But maybe in 2007 or 8, we saw that the technology for the LED chips was coming along fast enough that we could anticipate within the next few years you would see a way to do an LED product that was commercial industrial appropriate relative to cost. And so what I did was I went to some of my venture capital friends and I said, listen, we have customers like GE and Thermo Fisher and EMC. we're doing these kind of things to save money. We can see where the math is going to work. And so I really wanted to just recruit a team that had come from an LED company in Boston called Color Kinetics. So I got some of my friends from venture capital who didn't know that the climate tech, or certainly didn't know the building side, just to give us a seed note to recruit the team. So we started as, we called it Groom LED, but we basically put them in the back of our warehouse, and then we mocked up some things and took them out to the customers and said, would this work relative to the application, which was basically a computer light. That was really what it was, which was, mesh network, intelligent sensing, because an LED system, we knew the chip was the most expensive part, but it was much more of a venture capital type startup than what Groom Energy was. Groom Energy was, we didn't raise any capital really. We just started to do it on our own, and then it grew into a company that could fund itself. So it was a service business. It was a relatively low gross margin business compared to tech. So that was an interesting one to sit between. I was running Groom Energy as a service company, and then telling the venture folks, I can recruit a team, and then eventually we would build a company as a partner company to Groom Energy. So there was a period that was pretty entertaining where I was doing both. And that was actually 2000, I think we'd raised a seed note in like 2008. And if you remember, there was a period in 2008, 2009 that none of us can forget, that the world collapsed. Yes. So that was, if I reflect back to moments in time, that was a particularly challenging moment in time. Like, you have those kind of startup stories about when you almost, died. Yeah. I had two startups I was working on at the same time in that particular moment. I can still remember where I was sitting with my wife, Kim, at the computer when the world collapsed. And I'm like, oh, and I was looking at her, I'm like, I don't know how we're going to pay our bills. It was great.
Yeah, I can imagine. I was actually a little curious. That was, one of the questions I had planned to ask you was about the crisis, because on one hand, the real estate market completely blew up, right? And on the other hand, you're offering cost savings, right? Because you'd come in. I remember you talking about this back when we were on the Duke board together. You would, you'd go into a factory or a store or whatever and pretty much do the overnight work, and you'd have a pretty much immediate impact on cost, in terms of operating those buildings. So to some extent, you could argue it both ways. So it sounds like it went more the negative way for you during the crisis than positive
principally
way.
Because we were in a capital expense business, and when the world pauses, it doesn't mean people don't put capital towards savings. It's just there's a moment in time, and it also wasn't strategic, and it certainly wasn't sexy. And so in a world where you're fighting for capital, building retrofits was not necessarily going to be the top of anyone's schedule.
Yeah.
So and listen, there's moments in time when you try to assess how long is the world going to stay like this, sort of like we're going through right now in our current market. But that was, with startups, I think, and I relive it today with some of the companies I talk to, that, how you weather storms is a real test of, do you have something you believe that fundamentally can survive like mini cycles? Longer cycles are different. And, at some level, it's a reminder of like we have today with all startups, which is cash is king. Like, you have to be able to weather the storm with cash in some cases. So we didn't have a balance sheet on either company at that moment.
To go back to the earliest of days, how would you grade yourself as a, early first time entrepreneur? What did you get right and what did you not get right?
I don't think I imagined I would even be CEO of what became Groom Energy. When we first got it started, I thought of myself as a venture startup kind of person. But if I had to grade myself at that moment, I mean, listen, in most cases, we know growing companies, the report card is your own every day, every year. But in the end, a lot of these are measured on outcomes, maybe unfairly so. But at that particular period in 2005, 6, 7, I felt like I was leveraging my skills pretty well, because I had a venture connection set that would trust me that there was something there, and I believed there was something there, and they had conviction, and I think it turned out well. And on the services side, I think a couple of these key things, like how do you hire, how do you manage, and I wasn't a experienced manager when we were starting Groom Energy. It was, what you learn in startups is, you're not born a manager. You sort of grow into it because you're in a situation where it presents itself in many cases in startups. And some people, flourish in that, and some people it's not well suited to them. But it did work for me in that particular circumstance. It may not in of others. And I think one of the things you kind of reflect on is when were you happiest? I definitely wasn't happiest when the world collapsed.
Mhm.
I was more happy, I think, at different points where we had a lot of things going on, and as many customer focused startups are, we were really happy when you had a bunch of customers saying what you're doing is helpful, either through their wallets or just through them telling you, and that felt like you were really doing something useful.
I know you're not going, you're not doubling down and going for entrepreneurial experience number two, but if you were going to do it again, what do you think back and say, oh, I would definitely do this differently this a second time through?
Yeah, I think I have a healthy sense of you have to ask yourself what are the motivating things around anything that's entrepreneurial. It's certainly today it's a more hot term to be used, and even 20 years ago, startups were not as it wasn't as professionalized as it is today. So doing something that's risky, I can remember at one point I was at JP Morgan. I was considering going to business school, and it was a startup software company that was recruiting me to help them out. And I decided not to go there for a couple reasons, but one of the core reasons was I don't think I had an unfair insight into that particular market. I think I knew enough, but I think if entrepreneurs are pursuing things, you go back to like, what's the objective or what's the real insight? And I think it's a lot about markets. I'm probably more, there are some people like, listen, you find very bright people and they figure out things and they pivot and they move along. Other people are like, you go after markets that are at the right moment for a startup to grow into it. I'm more biased towards the market side of it. You want to have like great teams and you want to have a bunch of things work out, but I first start with markets, and I think if you ask yourself today, if I'm an entrepreneur going after a market, you have to ask, what do you understand about that particular market? The matching feature, which is hard, is young people who have not been in markets per se but have insights are trying to validate, do I have unique insight? And so do I know enough about a market that there's something can be applied? And when those things work, I think that's a really good reason to pursue it. And the second thing that matches to it is, how you choose those who you do it with. And my principle for that has been pretty basic, which is you follow great people who you want to be around, you want to be like them. And I definitely use that a bunch in my career. So that's if I was doing a startup today and I was, in my 20s and I had this solution of there was some fundamental insight I could match to a market, however I got there. The risk profile is great when you're young, so you should do it.
You definitely have fewer responsibilities when you're young.
Yeah, we
It's
do.
funny. I have some friends, who are in the entrepreneurial space who would say that experience is a bad thing. You need to come in with a fresh perspective on a problem, and it's harder to do that if you've been in an industry for a long time. And I guess if you think about this in sort of like, do you go for the people? Do you go for the market? Do you have experience? Do you not have experience? And kind of
Yeah,
created that into a 2x2. I think if I went and asked, 100 entrepreneurs, you'd probably have reasonably, dispersed distribution about where they would say the sweet spot
good.
is, in that 2x2 matrix. It's just interesting how different perspectives come to bear on that topic.
Yeah, I think we're burdened, at our age. There's a lot of head trash that goes with reasons that markets were really hard. Like, the whole I've seen the movie before problem.
Yeah.
And so you're always trying to balance that with, some level of optimism bias. And again, I keep coming back to like, if you have fundamental insight on why adoption might happen, you got to ask yourself where that came from.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, as an entrepreneur, you need to have a certain degree of irrational exuberance, right? Otherwise,
Yeah.
you wouldn't even start, because odds are you're going to fail, right? As most do. But
Yeah, and so it's a function of your risk profile for startups. But I still think that there's a question in today's world on how different it is, because I do think startups they're so much more professionalized. The
yeah,
infrastructure, the financing, the awareness of prospective employees. Like it used to be that you recruited someone to a startup and you're going through like how does equity work? And like today, everyone coming out of college has already learned a ton more than I knew after I'd been in them for a while. So that helps. It helps make it feel like the risk might be less actually.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, you think about just all the accelerators that are out there, the wealth of material that's available, the Y Combinator, kind of model and all of those things that you can get access to. You didn't have that, back, when you were starting your company. You had to figure out a lot more for yourself.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it wasn't just as challenging for either side today or back then. It's just a different bar. And so the bar for today, like, if you ask what should anyone who has a bias towards that risk profile, why would you not try it if you felt like you were around people in a market that you liked? Because it used to be, I think there was concern around when startups failed that you were marked.
Yeah.
But today, to your point, like if most of them are going to fail, it's really around trying to what chapter of experience do you want at what point and what market with what people.
Yeah, I think that, failed.com era, go back to the sort of 21 years ago, 22 years ago when the dot-com market blew up. There were so many people who had gone off to do a startup in that late 90s boom, that after that it became a lot more acceptable, to your point, to have tried, not succeeded, learned a lot from it that you could apply into the next job that somebody who had maybe, just bided their time in a big corporate job wouldn't have been able to bring to bear. So I think it definitely works in your favor, to have that experience. I certainly would encourage people to give it a go at some point.
Yeah, I think the other thing is tech, just in general.
Yeah.
The tech maturity for everyone is so much higher, and so it is pretty fundamental. Like at Activate, the bet is that we're looking at basically tech stacks that can affect, energy, mobility, and industrial tech broadly, where the next level of adoption is it's not the first time they've done something, it's just that some of the solution sets that are being built, are really fundamentally changing industries. And so the tech leverage is across all these industries, but yet the employee bases are all much more aware of it. It's not,
Mm.
tech isn't narrow, it's a horizontal.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, being a tech geek became cool, right? Somewhere
Yeah,
along the
maybe.
way. Maybe it was, all the tech companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and the others. Maybe it was Big Bang Theory. I don't know. It was probably a combination of all of those things, but it's cool to be a geek now. So obviously you had a tremendous amount of opportunity, running this company, being the CEO and founder of it, to kind of set the tone that you wanted to set. So how did you approach it in terms of your own leadership style, and how did you think about the kind of culture that you wanted to create in the company?
Yeah, it be like many things. If you didn't imagine you were going to be running something at some point, and for me, it was, you kind of went on a couple of base principles. So I can still remember when we were only 10 or 15 people. Uh, I think I sort of four bullets every year. I said, get smart, work smart, do what you say you're going to do, and be ethical at all times. It was pretty
Mm,
basic. And the get smart part that I was trying to apply was that because we were only 10 or 15 people, I wanted everyone to, basically solve on their own what they needed to know. Study the what out of everything you can find, and obviously, there's enough on the net to solve at that point that they can go study anything, technical, business, whatever it was. And the work smart thing, I think, was in startups, there's this concern about burnout. And so the principle I always want to apply is that I don't want to micromanage. I trust that if you're, driven, you're going to work as smart as you can, not to burn out, but you're going to work smart in like every level. You're going to make decisions around what isn't worth your time, what isn't something that's a priority. Because the other thing about that particular moment in time was there's no management infrastructure. It was like everyone was just had to trust that it was flat. And
yes.
then the do what you say you're going to do for us was pretty critical. That I had to apply because we were distributed. We were work from home with the first 15 people. I think we had people in 5 or 6 states when we were 15 people. So back then that was maybe a newer thing, but it reminded you that the only way you can work remote as a team, and we didn't have this kind of format. It was, just living on cell phones, is that you had to trust that if someone said they had the baton, they were going to carry it and finish it. And then be ethical and honest at all times, of course, is a priority. So those are four that I lived on. I thought about that later when I was actually finishing up when we were I was leaving, I looked back at some of those things, and they applied. I mean, there was much better, more mature versions of that. We had employee documents, we had, statements of this is what you're going to sign up to do, this is what matters to us, these are our principles,
Right.
these are our safety policies. We had all that by the time I was transitioning out. But those four simple things I came up with in 2005 or six, I still would use them today.
What you hinted a little bit earlier at sort of what mattered to you in terms of the people that you wanted to surround yourself with, but how did you think about hiring people? What did you look for in particular?
Well, we were talking about LinkedIn before. Even back
Yeah.
then, I was using LinkedIn. I remember cold calling people on LinkedIn. Like we were looking for a team member in Atlanta, and I remember I found exactly the engineer we needed in Atlanta because we were doing building projects around the country, so we needed people to be near the buildings. I still remember calling someone where I unfairly critiqued their background on LinkedIn and said I think they were at the right age, the last job they had taken, they had been promoted. And I just called them and said, you don't know me, but my sense is, you should be talking to us about a role where you would be the business development lead in the Southeast. And I didn't know how that conversation would go, but what's fun is if you unfairly critique someone on LinkedIn and then you provoke them on a cold call, you just see how they react.
Yeah.
And so that was the most revealing way that I would engage with something, as opposed to later when we had, search firms helping us, or we had, traditional recruiting. But what I always applied, and apart from the basics of what you try to assess on any interview about someone, are they motivated? What drives them? What decisions have they made? All those things aside, the other thing that I lived on in venture capital, and also as a manager, was best blind due diligence on people, which is not that glamorous, but it's a pretty important way to validate your view of, is someone going to work for the team. So the other technique that I used that was the most important was I wanted to interview whoever we were going to hire for so long that they felt like they were working for the company by the time they were joining. And I actually had one team member who said that to me when we had a lunch and I gave him the offer, and he said, I've already been working for you. Like, he's like, you don't have to give that to me now. Like, so that is only possible when you start a recruiting process like really early, and you talk to people and you say, we're not ready for you right now, but a year from now, I bet we're going to grow into you, or 6 months from now. And it just takes a lot of time. But for the early days when you're hiring skeleton teams on startups, where each person is that much more critical and the organization is fragile, I could do that. But that breaks at the next point on. But the base principles are still the same, which is you try to get back channel due diligence to validate your assumption on someone, and you make sure that they know absolutely everything about the company, and it kind of solves itself through that process, even if it isn't, exhausting for 9 months.
Yeah, there's actually been even this week, I don't know why it's sort of popped this week, but there was, I think, an article on Vox about just how laborious the interview processes are becoming, with personality tests and mock presentations and group interviews and all these things, and to some extent saying, like, where is this all going? It's getting to be almost consuming. It's funny that you bring up the notion of saying that the person would say that they almost feel like they were working for you already before they joined the company, because I think that's one of the things that people are feeling is like they're just really being put through their paces. And there's people sit on both sides of this argument about people are saying it shouldn't be this hard to hire somebody. I understand why people are doing more diligence, because it's legally, it gets harder to get rid of somebody as laws continue to tighten around that. So you want to make sure you're making the right decision.
Yeah, I think the reverse is true though as well. Like, and listen, I'm putting on a lens here towards startup and growth companies. Big companies
Yeah.
can't do this. Once I was part of EDF, the French utility with 180,000 employees, I could not do what I was doing when we were a startup. So it's very much a function of what size company and what kind of team members you're looking for.
So you, obviously the company survived the crisis. You went through a period of growth between then and when you were acquired. What did the company look like at the point where you did the deal, and what made that the right time to do that deal?
Yeah, I think we were tracking that in our particular sector, the building energy efficiency sector for commercial industrial buildings in the US, what we knew was going to be the most valuable thing. This was never going to be a public company. there's one public company in the sector called Ameresco, but we didn't anticipate we could grow into anything like that. But the European platform companies were going to come to the US. And so it so happened that over a period of a few years, they started to come to the US. So we knew we were going to be a target for someone like that. And I stayed close to a banker for 10 years. And every year I told them our business plan and said what we did. And I said, I just want you to know when the market says they're looking for something else, I want to be getting that call. I want to have the first right of that meeting. So the Europeans were coming through. We were acquired in 2016. They started coming, I think, in like 2014. And what that means by coming is that, the biz dev people were in, they were looking for platform companies. We were a good target for that. And I didn't know how it was going to go. But we grew substantively. We were a leader in our sector for commercial industrial customers. We had Walmart and Target and lots of big enterprise customers. We were working on buildings across all the country. We had done enough work across the country that we were national in nature, although I think we only had employees in 22 or 23 states. But we were a good target for a European player coming in. So I knew that, and it just so happened that at the end, it was EDF was the company that we chose to go with. And that brought on another chapter, which any entrepreneur who's sold the company knows there's sort of that founder's dilemma of what's the right time to sell. We didn't have investors. We had investors. I'd raised a little bit of private capital, not Digital Lumens. We had raised venture capital, but for Groom Energy, we only raised from private capital. So effectively, it was our decision to manage that process without having to manage investors as closely. The investors were supportive of, whenever you decide is right that someone should be buying you, we're supportive, and it worked out great for them. Obviously, the judgment they can make is that it went well because they got a lot of capital back. And then, for me, after we were acquired, I think one of the things you were asking is sort of, how's that go? Well, the process was efficient. We didn't write a PPM. I said, I'll do a Zoom call. I'll come see anyone. I didn't involve any of my team when we first had the conversations. I tried to flush out, and we didn't even sign the banker until after we had the term sheet, because I just had a handshake saying, listen, I don't want to spend time with us unless we think it's real. So that worked out well. I was definitely proud of that efficiency around many deals get caught up in, many companies get caught up in an acquisition M&A cycle, and it can blow the company up. So I was determined not to have that happen. So after we did have success, I think we closed in September of 2016. The acquirer is EDF, the French utility, which is today 85% owned by the French government, soon to be 100%. They're going to take it back. But I was basically a French government employee. That was a pretty wacky journey after that, because if you remember what was going on in 2016, there was also some amount of challenges around our political situation on what was going to happen relative to the change of the motion of the country.
Right.
So I signed up for an earnout, which ended up being longer than I had planned. And then, I learned through the next 3 or 4 years how to be a French government employee.
I was curious about that because on paper you were doing the same job, but obviously being part of a massive, mostly government-owned, French utility, it had to feel different. What was similar and what was different for you in your role post-acquisition?
Well, some of it, obviously I was still running the company. We were the first, which is my objective, is if we were going to become part of a European company in the US, the preference for me was that we were the first.
Yeah.
The first of what would be a series of acquisitions. So that was the part that was exciting to me, is that we saw a way to be the lead, that we would stitch in other companies to do a fuller solution set of energy building companies, if you will. So I was sort of double timing it relative to running what was Groom Energy that became Dalkia, was the division that we were under, and then also looking at what else might fit relative to acquiring other companies, which eventually we did acquire more companies. What was different was that, a large company that buys a US company, we're the first one. There's an educational process, there's a relationship development process, there is an administrative process. You can probably guess was the first time I got the EDF compliance manual. I mean, It was an electronic thud factor that was like this thick. And I hadn't been around that since my days at Hewlett Packard and JP Morgan. So I knew that was coming. And so, I think I took on the role for the first year of trying to grow our employee base into the benefits, but not the tax of being part of a big platform company. That was my adjusted role, in addition to running the company and trying to look for M&A that would help us grow a national platform. I'm not saying that was the easiest. I'm just saying that was a role that was, I was required to play.
You mentioned digital lumens a minute ago. What was that about? How did it fit in with what you were otherwise doing at Groom?
Yeah, so we were a reseller as Digital Lumens. So eventually I hired the first 4 or 5 people with the capital we had raised. We built the first product. And then fortunately, I was able to recruit a CEO to take the company to the next level of the pilots, and the first product was designed and the patents were filed. And so we ended up becoming, Groom Energy was a reseller of Digital Lumens, and Digital Lumens was working with our competitors as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so Digital Lumens went on to raise a bunch more venture capital, and itself was acquired by another European company, Osram, in 2000 and around the same time, 2016, 2017. So we were both at a stage where, for different reasons, we were considered as targets for acquisition.
And I know you've done some advisory work over the years as well, advising startups. Having been an entrepreneur and played that advisory role, what do you think makes a good advisor to a startup? And, how should an entrepreneur think about selecting the right advisor for their particular situation?
To generalize, I think the best entrepreneurs who are seeking some sort of advice, call it a formal advisor or just someone that they lean on for certain things, is to know how to fill in your blind spots and how to get validation for the things that you're trying to make decisions on. So advisor is different from governance and board structure. Just advisors, I think, of more loosely affiliated, but there's some context. I think with some situations, I've literally been someone where a CEO can just vent to me, and my job is just to shut the hell up and listen.
Yeah.
And I had my own way of getting that done with Groom Energy. Digital Lumens was different; it had a board structure, but I think it's very much a function of what the individual believes they need, and as opposed to the formal advisor thing that says that there's somebody who's bringing visibility to the company, and perhaps where I think a lot of people think of advisory boards as saying someone who's senior, who's in the sector, who has customer connectivity or context for the technology. I've played more the role of someone who, because I've worked as an executive and in venture, that I can just listen, and if I can answer or react to some ideas, it kind of gives slight validation to what might be things that are otherwise, you're kind of lonely sometimes as an entrepreneur and a CEO trying to figure things out. So that's typically the role that I've played more of. But I do know that other advisors, they bring something different, which is they're really visible. They have super senior connectivity. They know the technology stack, as I mentioned. So I do think it's around, if you have blind spots or you have needs in any of those, you can assemble a handful of advisors who each bring you something very specific.
Yeah, and I think that sort of portfolio approach to it makes a lot of sense, right? Getting people with different backgrounds and different skill sets, and using that to fill in for each other, in addition to filling in for you as the founder, CEO in those situations.
For me, what was hard when I left Dalkia EDF and I was doing some more advisory work, and I had been in a CEO role, and I was used to doing something that I had done for a number of years, I was probably unused to not knowing the answer from my experience base when I was trying to advise anyone, because what I realized is how little you really know about a company. So the frequency of communication, the types of materials you read, and how you provide any reaction to anything. I was reminded during my year after I left EDF, I was more humbled that when you're trying to be an advisor to anyone, you have to start every conversation with qualify, I know this much, because you actually know even less than that.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty humble about that now, even with the companies that are in our portfolio. So I think if you have advisors that fit your personality, you want to share your experiences with them, and you can develop a relationship, and there's going to be a regular dialogue, and it's more natural, those are probably the ones that you should first focus on if you're looking for advisors. You have to get energy from a conversation. You have to find that it's not a tax from a handful of people, and you have to want to invest to teach them more about the business because they're not going to learn otherwise. The reactions are going to be highly qualified.
Yeah, it's a good point. Across the different things you've done over the years, I mean, you've been in tech, you've been in banking, been in the energy space. Sustainability certainly been a key thread for you over the last 20 odd years. What have been the other consistent threads that are woven through your career?
I think at the end of the day, I still remember the core principles of focus on who you work with. I went to my first startup. It was an internet startup in 94, 95, open market. And it was an internet startup, and I couldn't spell internet. I had been at Hewlett Packard. And I was going to take a job at CSC Index as a consultant because I was trying to figure out how to grow into what really was related to internet. And I was following someone from Hewlett Packard who went there, a guy named Bob Weinberger. And through Bob's joining this startup, I met a couple other people. And I went to interview with them, and I left saying, I have to work with them. I don't know what the internet is, but I have to work with them. And I had the same experience when I even finished up Duke, because you and I both did the Duke thing. I was an electrical engineer, and I was going to go work for GE in one of the manufacturing management programs. And I went to Wall Street at JP Morgan, and I interviewed with a bunch of people, and I'm like, I don't know what banking is, but I want to be with these people.
Yeah.
And so it was not about domain. It was just my interview of them while they were interviewing me. I'm like, I don't know, but I would desperately want to be around you. And it wasn't because they were identical to me. It was just the energy I got from the interview process taught me that it was secondary about what the company did at that moment. But that principle is probably true today. I look at it when we're investing in companies, because when you invest in companies in venture capital, like, you're investing for a long time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you have to be best friends. It's just there's something you get out of those relationships that you think is going to make you smarter, make you more fulfilled, push you to be your better version of yourself, for all those cliches.
Yeah.
So that theme is probably true today. When I talk to my kids coming out of college, like, what do they want to pursue? I'm like, start with that.
What have been the best times for you professionally? What was it about those that made them, particularly special?
I tell you one thing that is part of my world is I'm looking for light times, not just like the ring the bell win times. And so I measure, like, if you're in meetings with team members and people are laughing and having fun, in addition to having great outcomes, if you can match those where people bring energy from like literal like laughter, if you can match those two, like, I can remember the best times when we had successes when when open market went public. That was a big moment, like a moment in time. It was a journey up there, but that was a defining moment. I can remember, obviously, success post selling companies as being moments in time, but the journey up to those, the being scared of not knowing how it would work out, was, as my daughter and I have a term called nervix, and nervous and excited together. Like, the nervix periods were the best. They were the ones that ended up, the evidence that I can say is more defining is, like, we went public, or we were acquired, or we got a great customer. Like, we just signed, a really key customer that's really company forming. But it was the nervix part leading up to that, and people were energized. And the other thing I measure was their laughter in the room during the process.
You and your daughter have your own word for it, but I think the psychology literature would back you up in saying, I think it's something like, if you're 15% out of your comfort zone, that's where you perform at your best, because you've got to be on your toes. It's not rote, but it's not so out of your comfort zone that you feel overwhelmed or just completely
that's probably right.
uncomfortable about what you're doing. I think Daniel Pink's written about that too in his book Drive, if you've read that book.
I love Daniel Pink. I haven't read Drive, but I think if you the other thing that you can relate to when you've been through these journeys is, what were those around you getting out of the process?
Yeah.
And so for me, if you go back to this, CEO investor, I remember times when our teams were more fulfilled individually and collectively. And like I felt so lucky to have been around that. And so that those were defining moments where I could see teams have success together and I happened to be part of it. That was stunning. And then on the investor side, when I talk to companies today, many cases I find myself saying, like, memorize this moment because the way they're articulating, and we're a growth investor. So, you're hearing these stories where inflection is coming. And so that I can see through their characterizations of the moment in time they're in. I'm like, just memorize this because it's just spectacular. And it is this wonderful Nervix kind of thing. But they have confidence, but it's not exactly sure how it's going to play out. Those are probably the most important times when you're in these startup journeys, apart from the ones where you're worried about the company going under.
Yeah, those are probably more nervous than excited.
Well, it makes you respect some basic things like, you appreciate when things are going well, when customers are paying their bills, when you have your first closes of key customers, when you have cash. Like, these are, I think some of what's going on today, which I hear, folks our age considering, is that, people haven't been through these cycles necessarily. It doesn't matter, but the point is that there are some learnings. In some cases, it's head trash or tax that, like, oh, just remember when it was bad. And so the optimism bias that entrepreneurs usually have can get you through it, but it's a healthy respect for the fact that, sometimes situations are good.
Yeah.
We have cash, customers say they like what they're doing, we're growing, we've hired a bunch of great people, and it sort of gets over all the other stuff that's not so easy.
Yeah. What do you do to recharge your battery?
Today it's a lot harder, for what you and I are doing right now with getting away from Zoom. So I think today's world is around managing your calendar because the calendar fills in and you can't get away from it. For us, I told you, for the getaway, like, how do you get mental getaways? For us, we run up to New Hampshire, which we go up by Winnipesaukee, and literally the drive for that is therapy for me. It's actually just the drive because it's a really pretty drive, and where we go, there's not much traffic no matter when it is, even in the summer. So that's where an escape we get to. And then the other thing that I didn't appreciate, we have 2 dogs, and you've seen the meme or the cartoons for COVID where the dog's like, no more walks, like, so over the last probably 10 years, the dog walking, is as silly as that sounds, has been my getaway time. I take these out of my ears. I don't take my phone. And so there's like really basic things we do, like a drive and a walk.
Yeah, what's both those things are sort of physical environment resets, right? Which then gives your brain a little bit of a chance to reset, particularly if you leave your phone at home.
Oh man, that's a special skill you gotta have.
Yeah, to leave your phone at
What's
home,
yours?
especially in this day and age.
What's your escape?
Hiking episodically, I would say more, week to week or day to day, it'd be the running. It gets me out. You just, living in London, it's more city running, which I don't love, but you do get to sort of see different parts of the city, particularly on some of the longer runs. I can get to places that I wouldn't necessarily normally walk to, that are closer to where we live. So, but the hiking, definitely, when I can do that. It's a little bit harder living in London, not having a car. But I get out there, and it's the same thing. It's just a mental reset,
Yeah, I do think that we're all adjusting to the work from home thing, and we did it for the whole time we did Groom Energy. It was always a work from home company. So when COVID hit, we were doing Google Meet, so we did some amount of video because we were doing that with the French to try to save on some flights.
Yeah.
But I just so I thought I'd do a work from home company. We were all SaaS everything. Everyone had access to everything. Everyone was collaborating, and then we would fly to see each other for projects and for meetings. But I just think we're all witnessing this. My office is at home, and it literally is. I can do everything from here. So I think the escapes are a lot more what you and I just figured out, which is get outside and don't have electronics.
Last question. Any last career guidance you want to provide for our listeners or viewers?
Yeah, I mean, if it's operating centric, I'd say the one we didn't talk about. We said what were the best times. It's sort of how do you get through the challenging times. And as part from 2008, 2009, one of the tougher things I think that you have to consider is when people need to transition from companies.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking when you were saying like what are the highlights or the best moments, I can think of the most challenging that aren't as extreme as the world collapsing. The number one is when you have to transition someone from a company. And those are very defining for people. And I can think of some situations for me where I'm very proud of how that went. I can think of some other ones where I was literally scared for how it would go. And so those to me were the most difficult moments to know, is what you're doing correct? That's a judgment. As much as we have today systems for tracking performance and it becomes so obvious, like ultimately, I think from an operating standpoint for startups and for any stage company, you have a healthy respect for anyone who's had to go through transitioning, people both individually, but even, what's going on today in the tech markets, which is layoffs. These are the things that are the badges of honor. You say, if you do it respectfully and you do it as best you can, you're never going to feel good. But I'm more aware of that today, that having been part of the chapters that we wrote that were difficult, and I still feel satisfied, but it's part of what the world's going through today that I think everyone has to appreciate. You come up with your own style. There's no set of rules, but it's the hardest thing.
Yeah, it definitely is hard. And it's funny that you bring that up because I've been through a lot of rounds of layoffs, been on both sides of them over the years. And, it kind of comes with the corporate territory. I think if I were going to answer that question about sort of the times that have been the toughest, for me, the times that have been the toughest are just when I felt like I'm banging my head against the wall, right? And, no matter what you do, there's sort of some constraint around you that's just preventing you from having the kind of success you want. And those are just, for me, those are really the most frustrating times that I've been through.
Yeah, but we shouldn't end on a bad one. On the good, like the last thing I would say is that to the extent to which you write chapters in any company, whether it's by year or whether it's by a company, it is the case that we're all trying to assemble a set of experiences inside of our career journeys that somehow feel like they're building on each other. You'd like to imagine that. And so I think when I reflect back on the chapters, I do see relationships between them that sometimes at the moment aren't so obvious, but later you can see how you've assembled a set of things that have built on themselves. So you're more capable of, becoming, having an impact and becoming fulfilled.
Yeah. I mean, all those things they do come together, right? The accumulation of things you've done in the past, what you've seen, what you've experienced, what you've been through, outside of work, all of those things come to bear. So, and the wise take advantage of that, right?
Sometimes you have to learn it in retrospect, but yes.
Or the hard way. Fair enough. All right. Well, Jon, this has been great. Thanks for the time.
That was fun.
Yeah. I appreciate it. It was, you're another stop on the reunion tour of people I haven't talked to in a long time who I'm getting a chance to catch up with. So hopefully it will not be quite as long between now and the next time. And it's good to get an updated sense of what you're doing.
I'm glad to be part of Pathways' this program. It's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a good day and good weekend. I want to thank Jon. It was great to catch up with him to discuss his career journey, what he's been doing over the last 20 plus years, and his longstanding commitment to building businesses focused on sustainability. If you're ready to take control of your career, visit pathwise.io. And if you'd like more regular career insights, you can become a Pathwise member. It's free. You can also sign up on the website for the Pathwise newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to Career Sessions, Career Lessons. We hope the nuggets of wisdom shared today help guide your path to the successful career of your dreams. This podcast series is part of Pathwise.io, which is here to help you live the career you want. We provide a comprehensive mix of career and professional development events, insights, tools, and exercises backed by a group of leading coaches and other career management experts. If you aspire to something more or just something different in your career, join us at Pathwise.io. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. See you again on the next episode.